Welcome to the Citizens Reporter. I'm your host and editor, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. The Citizens Reporter comes to you weekly from the Valley Access cable channels in Stillwater. Now, to help me with this week's news is a regular Citizen Reporter, Mr. Mark Bradley. Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here.
And thank you for having me. And as always, I'm going to look at the national news and give you some information. But before I touch on that, I thought I'd make just a point here that when I was going through the newspaper, and this is actually in the Star Tribune of July 19th, it's talking about that Toys R Us will return with stores in Texas and New Jersey. So you never know when something's going to come back. And we got to kind of look at it with a chaste eye because of, as I was pointing out to Diane, when I was traveling throughout the United States on my vacation, I was looking at some of the other states, and there is still Sears stores actively functioning in other states. So my point is that we've been hearing about how Maplewood Mall has to look at, let's tear us down and build more welfare housing. It's another way of tearing apart the city, distressing the tax base of our city at this point.
I think, Mr. Bradley, one of your main points has been is that the area around the Maplewood Mall is zoned commercial.
Right.
And that there certainly is maybe some possibility that you could have additional housing up there, but at what cost of how much do you revamp it to say we want to change the zoning to be all housing and get rid of the commercial zoning that is currently there? Because certainly by having commercial zoning, that gives us the opportunity of being able to promote that area to other companies outside of Maplewood and say, well, gee whiz, why don't you come to Maplewood? Because, for instance, well, we've got a Sears store that is empty, that is attached to a mall. Right. And that there's maybe some other better and higher use for that other than building high-density housing, simply because the Maplewood officials and administrators want to support the BRT.
Right. And when I'm looking at it, I'm also pointing out the fact that Maplewood is an entertainment facility that isn't any place on this side of town other than Maplewood right now, and that when we're looking at it, the one thing that is really devoid in Maplewood is a first line or second line hotel. And a lot of the hotels, like when you take a look at what's happening in Southdale and the Mall of America, are combining their hotels and condos, but they're luxury condos, which would bring tax space and growth and excitement. And with all three of them there, I'm saying that what we should be looking at is not trying to destroy excellent location for people to go to, but actually double down on it to make it more exciting, to bring people to it, because it's the only east side area that is really very, how to say, intensively for food, entertainment, and everything else.
Sure, and I know that you certainly have pointed out the fact that the city of Maplewood, the administrators and the elected officials, have really had a very negative attitude when it comes to working with the new owners of the Myth and trying to capitalize upon the fact that they make that mall area a destination location 50 to 70 times a year. And so that is something that we've certainly have talked about on these programs. And you've brought up a good point about the issue about the location as a great area for a hotel, in that that is an intersection right there off of 694 and White Bear Avenue. Right. So it's an excellent location for a hotel, an additional hotel to be constructed there.
Right, and when I'm also looking at the other thing I wanted to make the point is, we've been being told that this reconstruction that's supposed to be a North End Working Group, which I was part of, and the name has been changed so many times for the bus route there, which is now Bus Rapid Transit, which it always was BRT, but they had called it the Green Line for a while, and of course I've been insulting them, saying that this is because they have the gold and the
But,
green here.
but keep in mind,
Right.
though, it's been now since 2018 or so that's been called the purple line.
Right.
And of course, most folks in this area know it as the rush line.
Right.
But yet it's given the color of the purple line.
But of course, Southeast Minneapolis is upset because they wanted the title of the purple line on their line. So this is how you get this convoluted attitude that's happening behind the scenes. But let's talk about up in front of the scene and what now is called the Green Line, which is now in Minneapolis, going to northeast Minneapolis, and they are now talking about throwing people that are how should I say? They are congregating on the light rail at night because there's no place else to go, and they want to have a dry, comfortable place.
So in other words, what you're saying, and I think that this has been in the news, and
Right.
certainly there's been public officials that have looked into this, is that
Right.
there are many of the homeless are living on the Green Line when it's overnight.
Right, when
Because
it's not being used as well.
Yeah, that's right, because it's clean,
Right.
it's dry, it's out of the elements. And so now the public policy is going to be to shut down those late night hours so that people can't sleep on the Green Line.
Right.
And what are they planning to do then with those homeless folks?
Well, that's a good question, but I also have the other question. How are those people using the Green Line if it is being used that much? We've been being told on the east side of St. Paul that, geez, we put that BRT in, it's going to be so highly demanded that everybody's going to be riding it. But you're seeing right in the newspapers that even when they're talking about bus lines that are actually active at this point, when they have a decision to make, they're considering that maybe it isn't worth carrying them on that much, and they are abandoning time and specific periods. Because people are supposed to be dependent on it, and if there is nobody using it at that point, it shows you that it isn't being used as equitably as we're being, how should I say, confused,
Well, it's
confounded to.
used as frequently
Right.
as that they represent.
Right, and that's the whole thing with this line over here that's going into Maplewood. They are taking, as I understand it, 2 lines off to justify 1 line on because of the White Bear Avenue. Is it back on or is it back off? It's been on again for the last couple of weeks I've been seeing. So maybe it is back on, but they had taken it off because they couldn't justify the people on it at the time. But they could also not justify the people that they're saying for the 61 if they go with this backyard production, which is supposed to tear up everybody's backyard and spend millions, I better be correct on that, millions and maybe close to $1 billion in deconstruction of everybody's backyards, and also kind of taking out our ecology as well.
Exactly, and eliminating that Bruce Vento Trail,
Right.
the Greenway Ecological Trail that goes north to south in the city of Maplewood. So now, Mr. Bradley, what's next on the agenda?
Well, what's next on the agenda is there is a settlement at last, and that's in today's paper, well, I should say Saturday, because we don't know when this is playing, August 24th. They're talking about $200 for the family of Jamar Clark.
$200,000.
$200,000, yes. A K's there, I should be sure to say. $200,000 for the family, which is a settlement because of wrongful death.
Now, in this particular article, we're looking at, it says here that the Minneapolis City Council on Friday signed off on a $200,000 settlement to the family of Jamar Clark, bringing the end to an emotional chapter in the city's history of police-community relations. And it says, after briefly retreating to a closed session to finalize the deal, Council President Lisa Bender opened the door to the reporters and went around the table asking her colleagues whether they supported the settlement. The final vote was unanimous. So keep in mind, under the open meeting law, they, of course, could be in a closed settlement, the closed meeting to talk about the settlement and to think of, and discuss the ramifications of it. But they could not take a vote on whether or not to move forward with the settlement in a closed meeting. So that's why they had to come out of that closed meeting into an open meeting and then take that vote in the open. So that's what they did. And that's the reason why they did it that way, because that's
Right.
what the law requires. And then it says that the final vote was unanimous. Then one by one, council members and the city attorney quietly filed out a back door without addressing assembled reporters and photographers. Well, you know, in Maplewood, they also have not necessarily a back door, but they have a side door that sometimes when there's a contentious issue at the city of Maplewood at city council meetings, after those meetings, the city council members, they slink out of that side door so that they can avoid anybody questioning them. So I think it's a common tactic, Mr. Bradley,
Right.
Oftentimes of officials when there is a touchy subject. Well, what's next?
The state correction official who resigned suddenly amid a probe because of what's happening with Sarah Walker is being investigated for unspecified complaints that she wasn't doing her job while she was there, and she resigned. And I'm saying that a lot of times what you're finding is that just as we're looking at everything else, a lot of these people are being appointed to jobs they cannot do. We remember Brownie back when there was the tornadoes and well, not tornadoes, but the hurricanes coming in to New Orleans, and what he did. Well, we have one up here, and we have examples all around where you have politicians being assigned to jobs they never were qualified for. And that's kind of sad, and it makes me frustrated to realize that a lot of times we're having this happen on a regular basis.
Right. And you never know what the politics are behind all of this.
Right.
Because who is, you know, in charge of the State Department of Corrections?
Right.
Paul Schnell. And of course, he was the police chief in Maplewood. And it's my understanding from the people that I've talked to that this particular lady, Miss Walker, was a close friend of his.
Right.
And that's maybe part of the reason why she was appointed. I don't know. But there's always a lot of things behind the scenes that never end up in the paper.
She must have had military training and, of course, all this police training as well, I imagine, just to get that appointment. If you sound sarcastic, it is sarcastic.
Well, it's just like how Nora Slawick was appointed to be the head of the Metropolitan Council, and that from the best of my knowledge on her resume, she indicates that she's been a project manager, and yet she was not able to manage much of anything while she was mayor of Maplewood, and actually most of the time did not understand the processes of many of the projects that were being undertaken.
Diane, I got to stop you here. She did manage. She managed to give away a community center. She did give away a fire department building. In fact, I think it's 2 fire department buildings. She's given a lot away. I mean, she knows how to manage giving stuff away. And that's what we got to worry about now that she's in there.
In the next half hour, we're going to be focusing on an ordinance that the city of Maplewood is going to put in place. And this is an ordinance having to do with reasonable accommodations in housing so that Maplewood is consistent and compliant with federal law. So as we get started, this is from a meeting back in July, from the workshop of July 8th. So let's take a look.
Is concerning reasonable accommodation ordinance. And Mr. Thompson, this is your area.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. So the city attorney's office and the city staff have drafted an ordinance that's before you tonight and is also scheduled for your regular meeting to essentially codify kind of a process for addressing reasonable accommodation requests under the federal law. And certainly Mr. Beatty can talk more specific if there are questions about the Fair Housing Act and what reasonable accommodation actually is. But in short, it's a means for the city to process requests related to fair housing and reasonable accommodation for providing a flexibility in complying with the city code. And that could potentially allow the city to modify or change some city requirements specific to a request that's provided to the city and are necessary for kind of eliminating barriers for providing housing for people that have a federally recognized disability.
In some cities, there are ordinances that say that if there are more than 3 unrelated adults renting in a household, in a house, that they can't do that, or that if it's more than 4 or more than 5. And so let's say that you have a group home that has a number of people renting in it that is outside of that number allowed by the ordinance. Well, they would have to then somehow get permission from the city. So this might be an example, and they'll get into that in more detail as we continue. Or let's say that you need to build a ramp so you can get into your home, but you don't have the proper setback in order to build that ramp. And so without this ordinance, you would have to go through the variance process in order to get a variance to be able to build that ramp. Or like a couple years ago, we were following a story in Maplewood where a lady wanted to build a small addition onto her home so that she could have a PCA live there with her so that she could live in the house. And building that addition on was, she had to go through that variance process because she didn't have the proper setback, and yet her argument was she needed to build this so that that way she could have her help live there with her in her house so she could remain in her home. So you see, up to this point, Maplewood has not really had a mechanism to help people with these situations if they fall under the umbrella of the federal Reasonable Accommodations Housing Act. So let's continue.
Like regular examples, and so one would be like the construction of an accessible ramp to access a housing structure, either a house or an apartment building, and for some reason that ramp can't comply with a zoning regulation, a setback, or some other type of regulation we have in place, and there's no other way to construct the accessible ramp to comply with our requirements. Or secondly, what we have seen a couple times here in Maplewood is sober living residences, and these are structures in which people that have chemical or substance abuse past, where they're living in a residence, but they're not providing. There are no services provided. It's just really a residential facility to which those people live, but they do exceed our maximum occupancy for unrelated people under our zoning code. So our zoning ordinance allows for no more than 5 unrelated people to live together, but oftentimes those sober living residences do exceed that.
So as he indicated, Maplewood requires that you can have no more than 5 unrelated people living in a household that are renting together. So let's continue.
Actually, in the city's past, we've issued at a staff level 2 approvals for sober living residences, one under a lodging license and a second under a kind of a separate agreement that we administered with the city attorney's office to approve those sober living residents, again, so that we're complying with the federal law. So what the draft ordinance before you tonight largely does is to just give us a kind of a straightforward and defined process for the city to follow when we receive these reasonable accommodation requests.
Now, one might ask, how is a sober house that doesn't provide services different from, say, for instance, a group home? Well, I think generally speaking, a group home does provide services, that they do have staff that are there at the group home. And under the law, group homes can have up to 6 individuals living within in the property without needing any special kind of licensing or or approvals by the city. Once they are over 6, well, then they have to go through an approval process, a conditional use permit process. So that's where there's a little bit difference. So if you were thinking, well, there's 5 people and 6 people in the other, well, that's where part of that difference is.
My biggest problem when I'm taking a look at this is that first of all, I think you have to define what the expectations of a sober home are, even if it is supposed to be non-monitored, because the fact is, everybody that lives in the area that has family and relatives there, and even their own facilities. I had an individual who got himself a little bit intoxicated, who ran into my pine tree about 3-4 years ago. The guy ran away from his car, so I assume he was very, how should I say, inebriated at the time. Now, with the sober homes, it can be an inconvenience if these people happen to have certain things. So I think you'd have to have certain requirements on the people and the people running the home to really specifically say what are the expectations for the neighborhood. Otherwise, you're running the neighborhood down, and it seems like almost like a Trojan horse to run facilities in because of if there's no requirements on what a sober home is supposed to be and why it's there.
And that's a good point, Mr. Bradley, and none of the council members asked that question, and they also did not go into that detail with regard to the expectations of how a sober house or home would be run. That's a good question.
Right.
Well, let's continue.
The applicant would need to submit an application to the city. It would be quite simple. They would just need to outline what the reasonable accommodation that is being requested and why it's necessary. And then that application would be reviewed against the standards that are outlined in that ordinance. And if it meets those standards, the city would then issue that license, and it would be a limited license to that property owner, unlike a conditional use permit or other land use approval. It doesn't run with the property, and it's not good for future owners. It's limited to that particular circumstance for which it's granted.
Now, the question that came to my mind when I heard him say that the approval goes with the applicant and not with the property. Let's say, for instance, somebody did build a ramp to make their home accessible, and that they needed a reasonable accommodation in order to do so because they didn't have the proper setbacks. Are they then required to then take that ramp down when they sell that house? They don't address that either, which perhaps maybe the ordinance says something to that effect that addresses that issue, but certainly during the presentation and the presentation to the council, they don't get into that issue. And let's say, for instance, that somebody did need to build a small addition onto their house, that because of setback issues, they wanted reasonable accommodations, and that this addition actually would make it so that they could have a washer and dryer on the first floor because they can't go up and down stairs anymore, and this is a requirement in order to be able to stay in their house. What happens at the end? I mean, doesn't that stay with the house? I mean, you're not going to take down this small addition that made this house an accommodation for this individual living in it. So you see, I can see where with a sober home that it goes with the applicant, but when we're talking about structures that you're building to make the house accessible, I don't see how that goes with the individual. It seems to me that that should go with the property. Let's continue with the discussion as they go through this a little more detail.
There would be a slight fee, just a modest fee that the city could charge just to cover any sort of processing costs that we have, but we would set that as part of our fee schedule to be, again, modest.
Now, the issue of fees, of course, can be looked at two different ways. Oftentimes when you have a group home or that you have an organization that is sponsoring a sober house, it is a nonprofit or a corporation. Now, if it is somebody, though, who is going to the city saying, I need reasonable accommodations to build that ramp or that deck or that small addition onto the house to make it livable under the reasonable accommodations housing act, then you see now you're talking about somebody who may not have the income to pay a fee. So on the one hand, you've got a nonprofit or a corporation, and on the other hand, you have an individual who might be a senior, who might be disabled, who is asking for that reasonable accommodation, and do they have the income to pay that fee? So let's see where the discussion on fees takes us.
The ordinance that is in your regular packet is the one I originally drafted. And the issue that I was wrestling with, that I think Mr. Thompson accurately described, was how much involvement does the council want and when? Do you want this to be treated like a normal land use application where it comes before you and you look at it and approve it or not? Do you want to only have a review possibility at the end? And who should have the ability to appeal that? And this draft is based on sort of a mashup of the St. Paul and Minneapolis ordinances, where they get a lot of these kinds of applications. And in my draft, I thought the council might want the ability to allow the applicant as well as anybody living in the immediate neighborhood to appeal it. And so that's the way it was written. Staff has decided that they think that's probably not a good idea. So the redlining that you see simply removes the ability of the neighbors to appeal, and it retains the ability of only the applicant to appeal. So
the city attorney talks then about the involvement of the city staff and how should the ordinance be structured as to when somebody submits an application, how will it be reviewed? Is it just going to be reviewed by the city staff, and then if they deny it, then that appeal process, that individual or that company who's asking for the reasonable accommodations goes before the city council and pleads their case? Or as part of that appeal process, does the neighbors have input into whether or not reasonable accommodation should be allowed or granted by the city to the applicant? Now, Mr. Bradley, this touches on the issue that you were raising earlier about how does it impact the neighborhood? And of course, you were talking more specifically to a sober house that has more than 5 individuals in it. And so the city attorney, he was originally thinking that that process would include notifying the neighbors, which is kind of consistent with what you were leading to in your comments. But now we hear from the city attorney's comments that the city staff believes that, well, they shouldn't include comments of the neighbors around that applicant's location. Now, of course, you could see it 2 different ways, is that certainly if somebody needs to have reasonable accommodations for a ramp, is that something you need to notify the neighborhood about? Probably not. It's not something that really has an impact on the neighborhood. From my point of view, if there's a ramp constructed or an extra little addition so somebody can have their washer and dryer on the first level so that they can actually wash their clothes and stay in their home. But then this other issue of reasonable accommodations to have a sober home of more than 5 individuals, maybe that does have an impact on the neighborhood. So should these 2 items be in the same ordinance? Now that's a good question, because they're treating these 2 items as both under the same ordinance. Maybe this ordinance needs to be split in 2.
And maybe it has to be looked at a little bit harder, because the fact is, the one thing I was thinking, if you have a social organization that's going to be building a facility, they can build it of any size they want. It seems like they're trying to shuttle more of these facilities into areas they shouldn't be, kind of like what was happening about 3-4 years ago when you found that a lot of issues were being from our state when they were letting a lot of felons and people that were incarcerated earlier going into the cities, and they were arguing that there should be houses for them to be in, and when we really should be looking at facilities that accommodate everybody. It's kind of like I'm getting up to retirement age. I'm looking for a facility that, as I'm getting more infirm and not able to do as many things, I may need to have certain things. Same thing applies to people who have alcohol problems, people who happen to have physical dysfunctions of their own. And some of them actually can be interrelated into a physical unit that can be constructed for multiple use.
Right, and the whole issue is that I can see is that because there is federal legislation about this.
Right.
There's always that issue that the city has to comply with what the federal law is.
Right.
And so it really is up to the city staff to ensure that they know enough about what that compliance is, or that the city attorney knows enough about
Right.
what it is, that when an application comes through, that they are basing either their approval or their disapproval based on the law and on case law, not based upon what the community thinks, because this is based in law itself.
Right.
And so that's where I can see where the staff is coming from in that regard. And yet, from the people's perspective, wouldn't they like to know? Well, there again, the need to know is in conflict with maybe what the law is. And what about the HIPAA regulations? I mean, maybe people have medical conditions that they don't want everybody to know about. There's also that, as you indicated. I mean, there could be all kinds of reasons why
Right.
somebody needs those reasonable accommodations. But let's continue with the discussion as then they get into discussing more about the fee structure.
I just feel like to have a fee for someone asking for a reasonable accommodation has a chilling effect. And I know that we ask for fees for lots of things. I would prefer we didn't have a fee for a reasonable accommodation. Mr. Thompson talked about incidents where people have asked to build a ramp or asked for a variance to build a ramp, or for the housing situation where there are more than, I guess, 5 people living in a non-relationship establishment. But I'm sure that there are other things that will probably come up. And just the idea of, and in my mind, and this is just my thinking about somebody who needs a reasonable accommodation because of a major life activity may or may not be in a position to pay a fee. So is there an opportunity for fees to be waived?
Now, Sylvia is newly appointed to the council, so she's one of the 2 new council members that were just appointed just a couple months ago. And so she brings up that question about affordability of fees for people who are asking for reasonable accommodations, because after all, the reasonable accommodations has to do with the fact that they've got some kind of recognized disability that requires an accommodation so that they can remain in their house. So it makes sense to ask that question. Let's continue.
Council, I would say yes. I mean, it's in the ordinance that there could be a fee, but I think it's a policy discussion for the council that if you didn't want to include a fee to cover any sort of cost, that there could be no fee associated with the request.
And so certainly they could decide, the council could decide as a policy that if the application is from an individual, that there is no fee. That if the application is coming from a corporation or from a nonprofit organization, that there is a fee. And you could even have it structured such that you have a fee for corporations and then maybe a different fee or a sliding scale fee for nonprofits, depending upon, say for instance, whatever their balance sheet is in any given year. Because we know that there are some nonprofits that have as much money in their coffers as corporations do. And then we know there are some nonprofits that really are operating on a shoestring. So you see, not all nonprofits are equally endowed with funding as it is. So let's continue as the council starts and continues this discussion.
An established fee now, or a fee has not been determined? It has not been determined? Okay.
Yeah, Mayor and Council, I think what the ordinance says is we would establish a fee, and that would be included in the city's general fee schedule
Okay.
for future adoption.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no fee because we don't have a process.
Right.
This is
Okay.
making up the process.
Thanks for that clarification. Councilmember Juniman.
In that vein, I love the weather girl voice. I won't be doing the weather, however. In that vein, do other places charge a fee for this that you know of? And if so, what's the range?
So that's Ms. Kathleen Juniman, who's been on the council for, I don't know, over 16 years, I think. And so her question is that other communities that have an ordinance similar to this, do they charge a fee? And if they do, what's the range? Well, you know, that's actually a reasonable question to be asking, to find out, you know, what are other communities charging? And let's find out what the answer is.
Unnecessary to even say, but sometimes people associate no fee with unimportant.
Can you please repeat that?
Sometimes people associate no fee with, well, it's unimportant. The activity is unimportant. So, I mean, if that could possibly be true, then it would be a nominal fee, nothing that would distress anyone, but maybe assign it some significance. Just a thought.
Okay.
So Ms. Kathleen Juniman asked her question about what do other communities charge and what's the range. And then before she even gives the staff an opportunity to answer the question, she has to then go and then spout off some nonsense opinion that if you don't have a fee, that means that whatever it is unimportant. So in her mind, in order for something to be important, you must have a fee associated with it. Now that accounts for why she is always fee happy on every single thing in Maplewood, because she thinks that the only way to demonstrate that it's important is to associate a fee with it.
All I was going to say about this is that when I was listening to the whole thing, I was trying to analyze it myself. I can understand a small fee for processing because you have to do some paperwork on stuff. And people who are going to do adjustments to their house or residence or the unit that they're working with are going to be spending money on it anyway, so that should not be, if it's a small minimum fee for processing, I don't see any problems with it.
Right, and keep in mind, this is in addition to like any kind of building permits
Right.
that they also have to get.
So you're
they
paying something anyway.
So they still would be getting their building permits, right?
Right.
And so that is a question though, Mr. Bradley, is that if they're paying a building permit already, you know, do you put another fee on top of that? Yes.
But like I said, if it's minimum for processing, it's only for the convenience of not putting extra charges against the city.
Mm-hmm.
The question I have is this going to be looked at like so many times where the city considers a new source of revenue?
Yes.
And that's
Yes.
the question that has to be ended. If they leave it as just processing fees, I see no problems.
Yes, yes. Well, let's continue.
Manager Coleman.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. I would also add that it's a lot easier either to have a fee or not have a fee as opposed to having exceptions or saying this, if you meet this whatever criteria, you wouldn't be charged. That's harder for us to do.
Because at one point, somebody was suggesting that maybe there could be a waiver that would be available that then the staff could determine if somebody qualified for a waiver and that they wouldn't be charged a fee. And so the city manager is saying, well, it's just easier for the city if they know there's a fee or there's not a fee. But there again, you could go and use that theory if you said if it's an individual, there is no fee. If there's a corporation, there is a fee. If there's a nonprofit, there's a different fee.
Right.
So that does give clear guidelines if they wanted to do that, but they didn't actually discuss that option. Let's continue.
When you talk about nominal, what are you talking about? Because right now, each one of us are thinking of a different nominal. So, and I understand that this is something that staff will have to come up with, but,
I think we have our city clerk sitting over there. What would be, you're familiar with all of the charges for the different kinds of fees that we have? And what would be, they range, I know, depending on what the service is, because it does take staff time. So what would be can you give us some examples of what would be like on the more nominal side of the fees?
Sure.
So that is the appointed mayor, Marley Abrams. Now, she, of course, is also appointed. And so if you've been doing your count, you've got an appointed mayor and you've got 2 appointed council members. That means that of the people that are up there, the 5 of them that are on the council, only 2 are actually elected to their position. Now, the 6th person that you see up there is the city manager, Melinda Coleman, and she sits with the council as if she were part of the council, which that is not really her role. She's not part of the council. And let's find out, though, what the city clerk answers with regard to the fee structure.
Right now, we have, as CD Director Thompson said, there is one sober house right now that is being charged an annual fee under the lodging license. It's $124 a year. I would suggest that would be a nominal fee.
And that is for a business, is that correct?
That is right, because in our experience, a organization owns the house.
Okay.
It is not just somebody that's creating their own sober house. It is an organization that's owning the house. And so, in this case, the organization is who pays that fee. They do have over 5, and so it is a lodging establishment.
So in Maplewood, how they've been dealing with this type of scenario is they've looked at it as a lodging, and that it's a facility that needs a lodging license.
Right.
Well, there again, that has worked, and the question is that fee, is that the type of fee then that they should mirror when they're looking at this reasonable accommodation statute or ordinance? Let's continue.
The circumstance where it's an individual home and it is a ramp for access to the home, what might be considered a nominal fee if that ramp could not be built within our code, and so we needed an exception there?
Sure. Going back into the building world, because you're now talking about a ramp, a deck, that sort of thing, for them, a base fee is $146 if you're building a deck, in my world, that's where that would go.
And that is a one-time only fee?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, as opposed, okay.
And so now we find how much it costs to get a permit to build a ramp in Maplewood, about $106. And so the question would be then, if you're paying your fee, and this goes back to what we were talking about, Mr. Bradley,
Right.
in that you have your building permit of $106, but then you need to also then pay another fee for reasonable accommodation of $106. Now your ramp, which you need in order to remain living in your house, has cost you double what a ramp would have cost you to build if you would have had the setback. Does that seem to make logical sense? When the only issue is the fact that you wouldn't be able to build the ramp is because of the setback.
Well, the one thing I was paying attention to, and this is why I look at it from the other standpoint, is the fact that First of all, this is a business, the one that is getting hit for the 125 anyway.
Well, but that's with regard to a sober
Right.
house, right? But
But-
with regard to a ramp, that most likely would not necessarily be a corporation. That would
Right.
probably be an individual.
And that's where I'm trying to make the point that I feel that they're trying to mixing metaphors, you might say here, because the fact is that an individual house or even a family unit where they're accommodating one to several people should be looked at separately from any type of corporate request. But I feel like the way this is written right now, it's almost like a Trojan horse that's sitting there waiting to invade us, because the fact is it leaves so many things arbitrarily open that it says, hey, anybody can do this as long as they can pull the permits and pay the fees. And that's what scares me about it.
And they have to qualify under the federal law.
Right.
And the qualifications required there, right there. And so let's find out what the next response is.
$140 for a deck that you want to have is not anything like a ramp that you need to have. $140 is not nominal. And I'm thinking about individuals. That's a lot of money for somebody who, very possibly, and I'm making this up in my head as we're talking, but what if this person doesn't work? What if this is the only way they can get in and out of their house? It's a lot. It's just a lot. I'm done.
Sylvie, I think, is on the right track.
Right.
In that she is looking at it from the perspective of that individual who has a handicap, who needs to have a ramp or some other kind of reasonable accommodation built to their home to make it so that they can live in their home and remain in their home. And you're right, Mr. Bradley, I do see that this is a different situation than when you have a company or a nonprofit who owns the property, who is the applicant asking for a reasonable accommodation.
Right.
That you have different financial scenarios that you're looking at. If it's the individual, like Sylvia said, very likely they might not be working, they could be disabled, they could be seniors, they could be on Social Security, disability. There's all kinds of possibilities out there, but it doesn't mean that they have the financial wherewithal that not only do they have to construct the deck or the ramp and get the building permits to do so, but then have to pay this extra fee for something that they need. It's not that they want it, it's that they need it. And so I
Right.
think she's on the right track, and yet the council really doesn't get to that issue that we have focused on, and how can you have these two very different things together treated the same in the same ordinance. It almost seems like there needs to be several different portions of that ordinance, or it's got to be split apart or something. So let's continue the discussion.
Mr. Love, do you have anything to weigh in on this? No, you don't.
Mayor and council, I don't know if I have really a whole lot to add to this conversation at this point.
He sticks to the asphalt.
Okay, got it.
Now, Mr. Love, he is a Maplewood staff person. He's, not necessarily the topmost administrative staff that they have, but he's up near the top, and he's from Public Works. So why exactly the appointed mayor is asking the gentleman from Public Works what his opinion is on this is a little puzzling to me, because unless he's in charge of building permits, which I didn't think Public Works had been charged with building permits. Not the last I looked, anyway. But I find that with this move, appointed Mayor Marley Abrams, I think she has this feeling that most everybody is leaning towards having the fees, and yet Sylvia isn't leaning towards the fees. So the appointed mayor is trying to see if she can get some comments solicited from the staff to persuade Sylvia otherwise. That's what looks like to me is going on, because otherwise, why would she be asking the fellow who's in charge of public works for his opinion on this ordinance?
One thing that bothers me about it, and really does bother me about it, is it seems, there was a show, it was called Much Ado About Nothing. And I feel this is the same thing here, because the fact is, first of all, the first question never was asked was, what is the need? What is the demand? And why are we looking at it now? According to what I understood from just what I heard, correct me if I'm wrong, there is only one group home that has anything in
And
this.
it's not a group home, it's a
It's
sober
a
house.
sober house.
Right.
I just wanted to put it in that category because that's where they started with. So you kind of led up to this type of scenario and say, oh yeah, we absolutely need this out here because we have so much demand for it. But what I'm hearing is there is one sober house and it has more than 5 people. It's actually got 6 or better. That's all I could hear on it. But the truth of the matter is there is no requests at this point. There is no demand, and there is no social group that's coming in for the request of it. So why is it, it's kind of like I said from the very start, I'm saying this is a Trojan horse.
Right.
Because of now they've created this new function that you don't get to argue on because you're part of the public. We're not going to have them discuss it. They've already made that decision.
Mr. Bradley, I think you're touching on a good question. What is the need for the ordinance? Because there's already federal law.
Right.
And currently the city's process is that somebody who wants reasonable accommodations under the federal law can make their request to the city based on federal law.
Right.
They don't need a city ordinance. All they need to do is reference the federal law. But when they make that request to the city under the federal law without there being an ordinance, guess what? The city cannot charge them a fee for the review of their request. So earlier you said you were wondering whether or not if this was just simply a way to create revenue.
Right.
And so here we are coming back to that again. What is the purpose? Why are we having this discussion when these individuals, they have the right under federal law to request their reasonable accommodation, and the city has to give it to them if they meet the criteria. That's what the ordinance also would say. But now the city has the ability and would have the ability to charge a fee for that application, whereas before they did not have the right to charge for an application fee. Let's continue.
The only thing I would offer is, typically when I look at establishing fees, we look at what the cost is to administer it. In a typical situation where we're reviewing something as simple as a reasonable accommodation with a ramp, it would be, in my mind, an hour's worth of staff time at the tops. Now, consultation with the attorney may add to that. I think what we could do for flexibility is have the initial fee, which we are consulting with the attorney, be in the range of what Ms. Sin said, but the annual renewal, which is just a much more streamlined, could be at a significantly lower cost, just so it wasn't an ongoing annual fee.
So now we hear from this city staff person, they're not only talking about an application fee, but they're talking about a renewal fee, meaning that if you have a ramp where you needed reasonable accommodations, that you would have to have a renewal fee every year? That seems like a ludicrous proposal for somebody who's trying to stay in their home, and that is certainly going to the heart of really disparately treating those in the community who are least likely able to afford such fees. But now let's hear what the city attorney says.
Manager Coleman.
In my experience with these kinds of things, the sober house is completely different. That does require a renewal. But if you're giving someone an exception to put in a ramp or an elevator or something else that would help them, be able to use their home, that would not have a renewal. At least that would be my understanding and how I've used it in the past.
City Attorney Beatty.
Well, going further on that, it was my concept that even with the sober house, it's not an annual license. I mean, you can talk about that, but my idea was that that would be good so long as the application, as long as the building, the development was there.
Okay. City Council.
So here we find that the city attorney was not drafting this with the idea in mind that there was going to be an application fee plus a renewal fee.
Right.
And yet there are some people on the city staff that they were thinking application fee and renewal fee. And then you've got the city manager, Melinda Coleman, who was also speaking in that clip, where she's saying, well, some of them they'd all have application fees, and only some of them, like the sober houses, would have renewal fees, and the people with the ramps would not have renewal fees. And so you see, there's a difference in viewpoint about this revenue stream up at City Hall. And of course, the City Council, they haven't really caught on that the folks who are applying for these accommodations, these reasonable accommodations, actually can rely upon the federal law, that there is no need for an ordinance at all. And that, of course, would alleviate the whole issue of fees that Sylvia brings up.
Right.
That if Sylvia didn't want to have fees charged, she could just simply say, well, why do we need to pass the ordinance? People can just rely upon the federal legislation that's in place, because that is what this is grounded in anyway. All this ordinance does is allow the city to charge fees for applications and or renewals.
And actually, if you listen to the city attorney, he made the statement that right now there is no renewal fee even for that one sober house yet.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here for our program today.
Thank you for having me.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in to the Citizens Reporter. We'll see you again on our next program. Bye-bye.
Well, where's the fire department, man? It's been like... Oh, they're pretty good. Yeah, sure.
That thing really going now.
Where's the fire trucks?
Yeah. Can't believe it's taking this long. That's like 20 minutes, dude. Yep. He's overhanging up my side. Okay. Holy crap, that thing went fast. It didn't sight well, did it? I drove by there, it was just a little flame. That's what it said.